This week we conclude this short series we've been doing leading up to Christmas that we're calling the Gift Exchange, where we've been talking about exchanging our burdens, really, and accepting what Christ has for us at Christmas. We talked a couple weeks ago about exchanging our worry for God's peace, and how the peace that He offers us isn't the kind of peace that we sometimes wish it was, in that He just subtracts trouble. But that His peace is real peace, a way of being in the midst of difficulty and still being okay, still being whole because of the presence of Christ. And then last week we talked about exchanging our hurts for God's healing. All of us are hurting, and some of us physically with illness and trouble, some of us hurting internally, emotionally because of what we are going through or have gone through, and He cares about both of those hurts. And His healing is offered to us. Now, again, that doesn't always mean fixing the ailment. It means His presence coming and being among us. That, in the midst of a broken world, God didn't send a fix for all the breaks individually. He sent Himself into the midst of it. This week, today, we look at exchanging our grief for His joy. Christmas is a tradition time. It's one of those times where we have our traditions that we do every year. When I was growing up, we had our traditions. In my family, my dad is also pastor, but we always lived a long way away from our extended family. So every year at Christmas time, we did the same thing. The first thing was, whenever my dad came to a church, he said, "By the way, I don't do Christmas Eve service. We're out of town to go see family. Christmas Eve service is on you guys." And so every year, my family would do Christmas early. So about a week before Christmas, my parents, my brother, and my sister and I, we did our own family Christmas about a week early. It was awesome. We got to show off our gifts before anybody else got theirs. But we would do our Christmas early because we were going to travel, and we usually lived 10 to 12 hours a drive away from our grandparents. And so we would do ours and then head off to our grandparents, who both lived in the same place. And then our tradition was we'd stay with my dad's parents, and on Christmas Eve we'd go to church together with my grandparents. We'd deal with church, trying to get home to open presents, as you do when you're a kid. We'd come back to my grandma's, and we would open all of our gifts on Christmas Eve with my dad's side of the family. Then the next morning, we'd get up early, we'd get dressed, we'd drive across town to my other grandparents' side of the family, where we would have Christmas on Christmas Day every year. Typically followed up with by a football game with the cousins and uncles after we talked them all into it. Then part of our tradition was we'd go back home. We always stayed with my dad's family. And the day after Christmas, my family of 5, my aunt and uncle and their 2 kids, and my grandparents, we all piled into my grandpa's conversion van, sitting very illegally all over that place, all together in the van, driving to the mall to go shopping. And we'd spend the day walking around the mall, looking at all the stuff after Christmas. This typically also included, and this really was part of the family tradition, Grandpa cutting off somebody in this conversion van and getting a certain gesture given to him on the way that my parents told us was the "Welcome to Wichita" sign. And then we would therefore welcome everyone to Wichita from the back of the van. It's funny to think about our traditions, the things that you always do. But it's also hard because those traditions are no more in my family. I've lost both of my grandpas in the first about 16 years ago, the second a few years back. So when I think about Christmas and I think about what we do, I remember them. It's hard to come to this, we come to this time of year, and I can't help but remember them and therefore some of the grief that left behind when we lost our family. And I'm sure you've experienced the same thing as I've told you, our silly traditions. I'm sure you've been thinking about the traditions that you've gone through in your life, and many of which with people that are no longer here, that are no longer around. It's understandable that Christmas time can be hard because of grief. This side of eternity, grief is a reality. If you live long at all, you will experience grief and pain and loss. And certainly at this time of year that can happen. Now, our normal plan for dealing with that isn't great. Usually it's to wait silently, to deny our losses, to delay our pain, and to distract ourselves. You know, like I told the kids, we try and kind of squeeze it down into this little thing that we hide inside of us so that we can keep a stiff upper lip and not bring anybody down and get back to normal and get through. But I really believe that God's plan for grief is different. His plan is not for us to belittle it or deny it or distract ourselves from it. God's plan is to join us in it, to come and be with us, to acknowledge the reality of our pain, to invite us to tell God about our pain and our loss, and to embrace His comfort in the midst of it. It's interesting, this week I was reading about this. I was looking at different various media about grief and joy and loss and pain, and I came across this video that seems to be kind of a training video for how to deal with grief. And as bad as we are at handling our own grief, we might even be worse at helping others with theirs, right? And we know it. I can't tell you how many times people say to me when someone else is hurting, I just don't know what to say. I don't know what to do to help them feel better. And so we typically just try to lead them into distraction so that they don't feel hurt anymore because we're uncomfortable. And as I told you, I think God has a different plan for grief. And what was a pleasant surprise to me is seeing that. I think that even in our, even outside of the church, even though not everyone that is studying this may understand God's role in it, they seem to understand what our role can be for each other. I want to show you this video.
So what do we do about all the pain we see in the world? All the pain we feel in our own lives? And why does it seem like our best efforts to help somebody feel better always backfire? I've been studying intense grief and loss, baby death, violent crimes, accidents, suicides, and natural disasters. And I've learned something really interesting. Cheering people up, telling them to be strong and persevere, helping them move on, it doesn't actually work. It's kind of a puzzle. It seems counterintuitive, but the way to help someone feel better is to let them be in pain. This is true for those giant losses and the ordinary, everyday ones. Educator Parker Palmer writes, "The human soul doesn't want to be advised or fixed or saved. It simply wants to be witnessed, exactly as it is." He's talking about acknowledgement here. Acknowledgement is this really amazing multi-tool. It makes things better even when they can't be made right. For example, somebody's struggling. Their baby died, or there's been a bad accident, or their mom got sick, and they're just sad. It's way more helpful to join them in their pain than it is to cheer them up, but here's what we tend to do instead. You have 2 other children, you need to find joy in them. Or, you know what you need? You just need to go out dancing and shake it off. Or, I felt really sad once. Did you try acupuncture? We're not really sure what to do with someone's pain, so we do what we've been taught. We look on the bright side. We try to make people feel better. We give them advice. It's not like this is nefarious. I mean, we try to cheer people up because we think that's our job. We're not supposed to let people stay sad. The problem is, you can't heal somebody's pain by trying to take it away from them. Now, acknowledgement does something different. When a giant hole opens up in someone's life, it's actually much more supportive to acknowledge that hole and let pain exist. It's actually a radical act to let things hurt. It goes against what we've been taught. In order to really support you, I have to acknowledge that things really are as bad as they feel to you. If I try to cheer you up, you end up defending yourself and your feelings. If I give you advice, you feel misunderstood instead of supported. And I don't get what I want either, because I wanted you to feel better. It's pretty rare that you could actually talk somebody out of their pain. Rarely does the admonishment to look on the bright side actually heal things for someone. It just makes them stop telling you about their pain. It's so tempting to try to make things better. When somebody shares something painful, it's much more helpful to say, "I'm sorry that's happening. Do you want to tell me about it?" To be able to say, "This hurts," without being talked out of it, that's what helps. Being heard helps. It seems too simple to be of use, but acknowledgement can be the best medicine we have. It makes things better, even when they can't be made right.
It's really what we're saying, isn't it? God doesn't fix everything all the time, but he steps into that place of hurt that we are and offers himself. See this in a couple places. Probably my favorite to turn to in times of grief comes from John chapter 11. For some, it's a familiar story about Jesus' friend Lazarus who gets sick. And this is what it says. I'm going to kind of skip through some verses here as we try and tell the story. Now, a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, "Lord, the one you love is sick." When he heard this, Jesus said, "This sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it." Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. And then he said to his disciples, "Let us go back to Judea." Verse 17. On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. "Lord," Martha said to Jesus, "if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha answered, "I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die." Do you believe this? "Yes, Lord," she replied. "I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who is to come into the world." After she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. "The teacher is here," she said, "and is asking for you." When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who had been with Mary in the house comforting her noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, "See how he loved him." Now this story is one that gives us glimpses of Jesus' full nature. Because in this, as he comes to his friends who have lost their brother, now he knows he has a plan to do something about that. But when he comes to them and he sees that they've been comforted, when he sees that they're hurting, both sisters come and say, "If only you would have been here, you have the power to fix it." both as they came to him, showed him their grief. And Jesus really stepped into it. Jesus, the Son of God, who knows that after this life, presence with God is not worse. Jesus, the Son of God, who has power over death and who knows that in a short amount of time he's going to go and actually raise Lazarus from death. That same Jesus, when seeing the grief that Lazarus' sisters are going through, wept himself. Experienced that grief by stepping into it with them to be there through it. Now, we also see that he is exactly who he claims to be, because he also has the power to come and to call Lazarus out of the grave. And the reality is, most of the time, that's not what happens for us when we experience grief and loss. It's not what we hold our breath for and expect to happen, that God is going to come and raise back to life those people that we've lost, or make everything better that isn't working out for us. But I do believe he does just as Jesus did. God steps into our grief with us, acknowledges our hurt, and offers himself. David wrote Psalm 30 as a song for the dedication of the temple. And he bears his heart before God, reflecting on his own experiences. Remember, his best friend Jonathan, he'd lost. His mentor Samuel. His first wife Michelle's affection, the first baby that he had with Bathsheba. He had lost a lot. Some of those were his own making, but the grief existed. And this is what he says in Psalm 30. I will exalt you, Lord, for you lifted me out of the depths, and did not let my enemies gloat over me. Lord my God, I called to you for help, and you healed me. You, Lord, brought me up from the realm of the dead. You spared me from going down to the pit. Sing the praises of the Lord, you, his faithful people. Praise his holy name, for his anger lasts only a moment, but his favor lasts a lifetime. Weeping may stay for the night, but rejoicing comes in the morning. When I felt secure, I said, I will never be shaken. Lord, when you favored me, you made my royal mountain stand firm, but when you hid your face, I was dismayed. To you, Lord, I called. To the Lord I cried for mercy. What is gained if I am silenced, if I go down to the pit? Will the dust praise you? Will it proclaim your faithfulness? Hear, Lord, and be merciful to me. Lord, be my help. You turned my wailing into dancing. You removed my sackcloth and clothed me with joy, that my heart may sing your praises and not be silent. Lord my God, I will praise you forever. So how does he turn our mourning to dancing? And does he change our sorrow that lasts for a night into joy that comes in the morning? He does that because God comforts us now by reminding us that he has walked through grief himself and is willing to walk through it with us. Isaiah 53 says he was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain. Like one from whom people hide their faces, he was despised. He comes to be with us in our grief, having been in his own. Just as our video said, acknowledging our hurt. And then he comforts us later by removing every reason for grieving for all eternity. The truth is, all of this grief that we may experience is temporary, because ultimately he will take it away. As he says in Revelation 21, I'm going to make all things new. See this city where God is with his people, and there is no crying, there is no death, there is no hurt. If this Christmas you are experiencing grief, that's normal. And it's okay to be in it. Not to distract from it, not to deny it, but to be in it. And to invite God to come and be in there with you. He knows grief and he won't belittle yours. And know that his presence will bring joy. Maybe not immediately, but his presence will bring joy back into our lives. Not that circumstantial happiness that comes from opening presents on Christmas morning, but the kind of joy that endures even in our grief. And if you're one of those that's with others that are going through that are struggling at Christmas time, that are grieving for loss, don't just try and move them into a different space, but instead acknowledge them in their grief. Be a ministry of presence even when you don't know what to say. God wants to take your grief from you and to give you his joy. He wants to take your hurt from you and give you his healing. He wants to take your worry from you and give you his peace. I want to invite you to let him exchange gifts with you this Christmas time.